Grace and peace to you from our Lord Jesus Christ and God our Father. It's good to see everybody tonight. And tonight we are in Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 to 18. Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 to 18. Last week, or at least our last time together, we began our study of Ruth. And we introduced those first 5 verses as kind of the tragedy of Naomi's life. I mean, she's a parallel to Job. What happened to Job, in essence, happened to Naomi. Job lost everything. And Naomi lost everything, except these 2 daughter-in-laws who are still with her. But the tragedy of her life, that kind of progressive tragedy, leaving her homeland, leaving Judah, Bethlehem, to go to Moab, to a strange land, a foreign land, a different land, to settle there, taking her 2 sons along with her husband, the 2 sons marrying Moabite women. Neither of the women had any babies. Presumably they were there 10 years. We don't know how long they were married and all of that, but there are no children. And so and then the husband dies, and then the sons die. And so we're left with a widow and 2 daughter-in-laws, which is tragic. It's tragic because there's no support system in Moab. There's no support system in a patriarchal society where everything depends on the males and the male heirs to give sustenance to the family. That's why the fatherless or the orphans and the widows have such a prominent, this is one reason at least, they have such a prominent place in how God looks at the culture. We know we have a healthy culture when the fatherless and the widows are taken care of. Because in that ancient culture, it all depended upon the males in the family, that support dependent upon the males. So without males and without children, without male children particularly, the widow and whatever daughter she may have are in a very precarious situation. It's a tragic situation. And there's no resource in the culture other than extended family. But she's in Moab. And all her family are back in Bethlehem, whatever extended family she may have remaining. So where we left the story last week was in verse 5 of chapter 1, where Naomi is sitting in this tragedy. And what are they going to do? And that's where we pick up in verse 6. So we're going to read verses 6 to 18. And I'd like us to hear it sort of like this. Think about kind of how this flows. Let's watch how it unfolds. So in verses 6 and 7, we have kind of the journey. They leave Moab and head toward Judah or Bethlehem. Then in verses 8 to, I think it's 13. Yeah, 13 is where I would want to divide it. 8 to 13, we have this conversation between Naomi and her 2 daughter-in-laws. And then in verses 14 to 18, we have this conversation between Ruth and Naomi. Right? So Ruth speaks up. Ruth says, here's what I'm going to do. And that kind of ends the conversation. This flow, I think, is really important to grab hold of. Because what happens in verses 8 to 13 is that we get this initial word from Naomi 3 different times. Naomi says, okay, return. And then she says, return. And then she says, return. And each time she's making an argument. Well, not every time. She offers a blessing, and then she argues why they should return. And then she argues even further why they should return with a more theological reason. Naomi's relationship with Yahweh, her relationship with God, is why they should return. Think about that for a minute. My relationship with God is so fragile, so problematic, that you don't want to be a part of that. I'm bitter, right? You don't need to share my bitterness. Go back home. Go back to Moab. Right? So as we read through, think about it. Think about that structure there. That's how the text flows, and we'll come back and talk about it. So, beginning in verse 6, Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 to 18. This is probably the longest reading we'll have in this class, but it all hangs together, which is very important. But next week we'll only have 4 verses to cover. So. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I have sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband, even if I thought there was hope for me. Even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. It has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus to me and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is a powerful text. I mean, there's so much going on here. I thought about dividing it into 2, but I don't know where to divide it. I mean, it's so integrated that I think it's healthy for us to think about it as a whole. But let's think about those first 2 verses to begin with. Why is Naomi thinking, "Oh, let me go back. I'll go back to Judah"? Why is Naomi thinking that? What has happened? Got food in Bethlehem, right? Food in Judah. It says she started to return, for she heard in Moab that Yahweh had given them food. Right? Literally given them bread. Bethlehem. Anybody remember what the word Bethlehem means? Beit, lechem. Yeah, house. But yeah, you're right. City, house of bread. House of bread. And so the way it begins here in verse 6 is Ruth says, I'm going to go back to Judah. I'm going to go back to Bethlehem, the house of bread, because Yahweh has given them bread. Does it sound kind of strange that she would hear that in Moab? That she would hear in Moab that what's happening over in Judah? Well, that's not too strange. They're not that far apart. If you're in Bethlehem, you're, depending on where you are in Moab, if you're near the Dead Sea, if you're near the northern part of the Dead Sea, up on the plains of Moab, which might be where she is, we're talking 30 miles, 40 miles, something, just depending on where you are in Moab. So it's not that far. But she has heard that the Lord has visited. What does your translation say? Considered, visited? You have a different? Come to the aid of his people. Okay, in verse 6, the Lord had come to the aid of his people and given them food. Visited, considered, come to the aid. Any other translations? Okay. So this is a very important word in the Hebrew Bible, God's visitation. A lot of times it's a visitation in judgment, but it's also sometimes a visitation in grace. And what we have here is grace because God is giving. God visits and gives, giving bread. And so they set out for that, to return to the land of Judah. The word return is used like 13 times in chapter 1, the Hebrew word for return. Use a word 13 times in 18 verses. That's kind of like some light bulbs ought to be going off, right? That's kind of like this sign saying, pay attention, return. So she has gone to Moab, kind of voluntary exile, you might say. But now she's returning to Judah. What does that sound like? Sounds like Israel going into exile and returning, right? Ruth may have been written during the exile or during the post-exilic period. We don't know when Ruth was written. We just don't know. Right? But if it does resonate, and one of the reasons Ruth maybe is a part of the third part of the Hebrew canon. Remember, the Hebrew canon has the Torah, and it has the prophets, and then it has the writings. And Ruth is put in the writings, not in the prophets. The prophets include Joshua and Samuel, and Kings, and not Chronicles, but Kings. And then the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, so on. But Ruth isn't put with the history books in the Hebrew Bible. It's put with the writings, which may indicate, again, we don't know, but it may indicate post-exilic. So this notion of returning is really important. We'll talk more about it next week when we talk about returning, okay? Because it says Ruth returned. Now that's interesting to talk about Ruth returning. She'd never been there before, but she's returning, which tells us that the word return is more than just location. It's more than just kind of displacement and coming from one place to another place. It has more of a theological meaning as well, to return. So they're going to return to Judah. Now, let's go to verses 8 and following. How would you characterize, in verse 8, we get this first time the word return is used. Maybe it's translated go back. Maybe it's translated turn back. In verse 8, she tells her daughter-in-laws, go back, return, you return, go back. Go back to where? Where are they supposed to go back to? Isn't that a rather strange statement? I mean, doesn't it sound more like in a patriarchal society, you return to your father's home? Go back to your father's home. But here it's go back to your mother's home. And you begin to scratch our heads, say, now why does he say mother instead of father? Some have even said that maybe this reflects that maybe a woman wrote this. That a woman would think more in terms of going back to her mother's house than to her father's house. I don't know if that's true or not. But the fact of going back to the mother's house gives us more of a feminine flavor, a woman's perspective sort of flavor, because we're hearing this from the perspective of Naomi and the daughters-in-law. Men are not involved, right? They're not a part of this decision process. It's the women who are going to decide here. But mother's house, wouldn't it be better if you go back to your mother's house and you're young enough, you can find another husband, you're Moabites, go back to your mother's house and to your gods, go back to where you came from, and it's going to be more comfortable for you, it's going to be more familiar to you, it's going to be more hopeful for you, because if you come to Judah with me, you're a foreigner. You know, that's a risk to migrate. You know how immigrants are treated, right? Immigrants don't always get an equal hand or a loving hand, right? So it's risky for you to come to Judah with me. You stay here, you go to your mother's house, you find another husband, you can have a great life, you can have a good life. And then what does she do? How would you characterize what if you're going to use a word to describe what she does for these two daughters-in-law? When she says, may the Lord deal kindly with you, what's she doing? Yeah, a blessing, right? She is blessing them. And what's she blessing them with? God's, what translations do we have? God's deal kindly, God's kindness, any other? This is a really important word in Hebrew. Fills the Hebrew Bible. It's the word chesed. Chesed. You pronounce that H like you're getting ready to spit. Chesed. All right. Yeah. Loving kindness or steadfast love or covenant loyalty. Psalm 136, where you have that refrain over and over again. The steadfast of the Lord never ceases. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. That's that word chesed. It describes who God is, right? In Exodus 34, that it is, God is described as, Moses says, I want to see you, God. Okay, chesed is a key word in that description of God, right? Covenant loyalty, faithfulness, steadfast love. So may the Lord, now think about how strange this is. These are Moabite women, right? These are two daughter-in-laws are Moabite. And Naomi says, the chesed of God, the faithfulness of God, the loving kindness of God, may God bestow that on you. She blesses them with God's chesed. And what's the reason she does that? Or what's the context in which she does that? Maybe not the reason so much. What does she say about how they behaved? The daughters-in-law. All right, the daughters-in-law are chesed people. So the word, may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt. It's the idea of chesed is applied to Yahweh and to the daughters-in-law. They have exhibited a chesed for Naomi and her sons, her family. And so may God show chesed to you about the faithfulness of God. Now this is really, I think this will be really strange once we get down to the end of this section. Right? That she's praying to Yahweh. She's offering a blessing in the name of Yahweh, you might say. All right, the second return. What would you say is the basic idea of the second use? Oh, by the way, yeah, we didn't talk about this. Part of that blessing is that they would find in, is it verse 9? Yeah, verse 9. That the Lord would grant you what? Rest. What else do we hear? Yeah, grant you a husband, grant you rest and husbands. But this word rest or security.
It said rest in the home of another.
Rest in the home of another husband, right? So that God will give you prosperity, that God will give you love, God will give you security, God will give you rest. Now, what is the promise of God to Israel? That they will come into the land and rest, right? So Naomi is saying to these two Moabite women that return to your mother's house, and I'm going to pray that Yahweh will be active in your lives to give you rest, to show chesed to you. Not thinking about the Moabite women as somehow part of another system or part of another god, or although she does say return to your gods in the text. But even with that, she is thinking that Yahweh can bring rest to these girls, to these women. Yahweh is not confined to Judah. Yahweh's work is also in Moab. And Naomi wants that for them. And she thinks Yahweh's the one who can do that. So she's praying for them, basically. So let's get to the next. They said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to return. We're going to return with you to your people. But then verse 11, we get the next turn back or return. And what's that one about? What's the question? Yeah, there's a question there. Why? What are you, crazy? Don't you have any sense? She's going to explain this a little bit more in a second, but you're going to return with me, your devotion to me. I can appreciate that, but I don't have any children in my womb. I can't give you more to marry. Sticking with me is sticking with your situation. If you stick with me, you won't have children to marry. And that's your security in the ancient culture for women. They need to be married, they need to have kids, so they have security, right? They have husbands. So why would you go with me? I can't do anything for you. Right? And then in the next one, the return, she continues the argument. Right? But she caps it off with, I think, an astounding sort of rationale. Now, she continues the argument in verse 12. You turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. And even if I get another husband and I get pregnant and I have 2 sons, you're going to be too old to marry those sons anyway. You're going to wait that long. It's you almost get the sense of that this is hopeless for you. If you go with me, it's hopeless. If you go with me, there are no options. You need to go back to your mother's house. because there you'll have options. But I think the kicker here is at the end of verse 13. No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you. We've both experienced bitterness. Life has been bitter to us. I lost my husband and my sons. You lost your husbands. You lost your father-in-law. We lost all means of support. It's bitter. This has been a horrible experience. But then notice the next line. Because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. So how does that factor in as a rationale? Turn back because life has been bitter. More bitter for me than for you. Turn back because life has been bitter. And she gives a theological rationale. Right? There's kind of a theological point here, at least from her perspective. The hand of the Lord is turned against me. Now, let's break that down a little bit. Let's think about that word bitter a little bit more. Remember earlier we talked about Naomi being kind of having the parallel experience of Job. Job is this innocent sufferer who experiences tremendous loss. Naomi, by all that we can see, at least in the book of Ruth, is an innocent sufferer who has experienced great loss. Both have losses, which means they're both bitter. They experienced bitterness. And this word bitter, which we'll talk a lot more about next week, so I'm not going to go into it here, because when Naomi gets to Bethlehem, she says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, which means bitter. Right? So the bitterness is something she's experienced, maybe something she's internalized, because that's how she sees herself. I'm not Naomi anymore. Naomi's name means pleasant. My life isn't pleasant. Don't call me Naomi. My life is bitter. Call me Mara. Job uses the word bitter 4 times in his dialogue. Talks about the bitterness of his soul. Job 10, verse 1. Job 27, verse 2. We'll talk more about the Job parallel next week, where we can go more into a deep dive into that. But I think the word connects with the story of Job. And then says, the hand of the Lord is against me. What is the hand of the Lord talking about? What is that a metaphor for? The hand of the Lord. What's it a metaphor for, you think? What does he mean by that? Hand of the Lord. Power, okay. Power, yeah. Power, action. The sovereignty of God. There's a kind of a sovereignty thing going on here. The hand of the Lord. When I look at my bitterness, when I look at the tragedy in my life, I don't look at that as just kind of a pure accident. I don't look at that in some kind of deistic way or secular way. I see the hand of the Lord. At least Naomi does, right? And Naomi says the hand of the Lord is against me. God has acted against me in some way. Same way Job felt, right? Job said the same thing. In Job chapter 12, I think it's like verse 10, 9 or 10, where Job says, looking around, cannot everyone see that the hand of the Lord has done this? Job has the same feelings. But why is it an argument for them to turn back? Don't go with me. Don't stick with me because my life is bitter. And it's only going to get worse. Maybe. I mean, why she's returning to Judah, maybe because she's hopeful. Maybe she's returning to Judah to die at home, to be done with this. Kind of like Job. Job said, I just want to die. That's kind of Job's opening laments. Job says, just kill me. Let's be done with this. But then Job changes his mind. He says, before you kill me, I want to talk to you. I want to have my day in court. So don't kill me yet. But maybe Naomi feels something like that. Life is so bitter for her that she just kind of wants it over. That that's a good question. Whether does she have hope going back to Judah? Is that a hopeful thing, or is that kind of returning home to die? Because she has no expectation that her life is going to be anything but bitter. Maybe. And she doesn't want her daughters-in-law to experience that. So it's a theological, hey, the Lord's against me, go home. Get out of my space. The Lord's against me, you go home. Because it's going to get worse for me, maybe. Maybe. Don't know for sure. Now, one daughter-in-law goes home, kisses her, goes home. One daughter-in-law stays. How do you think about Orpah here? Do you have a kind of a negative view of Orpah here? Or how do you think about Orpah? When you read about Orpah saying, okay, I'll go home.
She wasn't as loyal.
She's what?
Not as loyal, maybe.
Okay, that would be kind of a negative thing. She's not as loyal.
Or as close to her.
Maybe not as close. Okay.
More of a realist.
More of a realist. Okay. I'm sorry? Obedient. She surrenders to Naomi. She says, oh, okay. I trust you. You know best. I'm going to follow your advice. Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm.
Not the hero.
Right. Yeah, I don't think there's anything negative about Orpah in the story, because she does what Naomi suggests she should do. Right? She's affectionate with Naomi. She started out to go with Naomi, right? She was going to go, despite all the risk that involved for her. So she was willing to go. She started going. She refused the first offer, turned back, refused that. But then you might say she's the sensible one, right? The realist, as Pat said. Maybe Orpah says, what you're saying makes sense. In my culture, in the world I live in, that it's a hard choice. I love you, but seems like the reasonable choice. Now, I think that puts Ruth in a not necessarily in a better spot, but it lets us see into what Ruth's decision is such a gracious decision. Ruth does this out of grace. Ruth doesn't have to do this. Ruth could go with Orpah and go home, right? But Ruth is gracious to Naomi. It's kind of like, I'm going to go with you because I'm going to go live with you. I'm going to live where you live. I'm going to be a part of the people you're a part of. I'm going to serve your God. I'm going to die where you die. I'm going to be buried. I'm going to die where you're buried. I'm going to hang around even after you're buried. Right? That's a gracious act on the part of Ruth. Yeah.
It's not, to
me, it's not a sacrificial or martyr type thing. I think she really
Yeah,
she loves Naomi, and I think that's why we've been able to transfer it into marriage vows.
sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, Ruth is loving Naomi. Now, Orpha loves her too, right? But she's loving Naomi in a I don't know what the best way to say it is.
Like she was really her daughter, not her
Like
daughter-in-law.
her really her daughter, that there's a connection there. There's a love for her, a care for her, maybe. That's a part of that.
It's an extravagant grace. Is it fair to say though, before we have the Good Samaritan, we have the Good Moabite?
Yeah.
Extravagant.
Yeah.
over the top.
Yeah.
Well, did you have to?
Unexpected, no obligation. Yeah, like what? Yeah, like you're saying, Jeff. Jeff is saying extravagant grace, just over the top, beyond what is required, right? More than is expected. Because in the culture, you would probably expect her to go back to her mother's house. But her grace, I think we have to see this, whether we call it love or grace. It arises out of her sense of belonging, her sense of kindness, her chesed, right? Her chesed for Naomi. And as you said, a lot of people use this for marriage vows, right? Here it's not about marriage, but that's not to say you can't use it for a marriage vow. But here it's more about a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, which has its own kind of, really? All right, really? Mother-in-law and daughter, are you sure, that this is what we want to do with this? No, which gives us but I don't think we can do, that's more our culture. We can't really shove that back into this culture because we don't really know what that was like because of the social ties and the need to have that family support. Anyone have another comment about it? Yeah.
Reading this section, I see really our journey
Mm.
as far as Christian faith. And I see what Paul says so much in there. Ruth loving her like that and going with her, and no matter what happened to her, she's going to continue to love for her.
Yeah.
Exactly what Paul said in Romans. Nothing's going to separate us.
Nothing's going to separate us from the love of Christ, right? Romans 8. So what Peter's saying is that the love here is so strong, nothing's going to separate her from Naomi. She's going to go all the way with Naomi, even to being buried where she's buried, dying with her, you might say, sticking with her all the way until she even offers a curse. She curses herself, right? A self-imprecation. Almost some scholars said maybe she had some gesture, that when she said that, if I don't do that, then may the Lord, deal with me harshly or whatever. Maybe she went, maybe the Lord do, cut my throat, or something, even to death. So that kind of love that sticks with that person till death. Yeah. Pat, did you have something?
I think we tend to see things as black and white,
Mm.
right and wrong. But this tells me that there was no wrong. There may have been a better choice. And I think we need to remember in life that we make choices and we may not always make the best choice, but that doesn't mean we've made a wrong choice.
Yeah, Pat, thank you for that. I think it would be a mistake to say Orpha was wrong for doing what Naomi said to do. That she was wrong and Ruth was right. It's not about right and wrong here. It's about circumstances and choices and about your future. And listening to the wisdom of Naomi. I mean, what she said was wise. Now, whether we buy the theological point, that's another question. But given that context, Orpah made an appropriate decision. There's nothing wrong with her decision. And at the same time, Ruth made a gracious decision. Maybe she didn't want Naomi going alone. We don't know. We don't know what the internal thing was, except what the text tells us here about the connection between the two. Or I should say, Ruth's commitment to Naomi. A chesed. Ruth is still dealing kindly with her family. She has a chesed for Naomi. And what's Naomi's response to this? She said, 3 times is enough, man. I'm not going to try to argue out it. You're determined to go. All right. And she said nothing more. Now, some people have read that and said, Naomi was so mad she didn't talk to her daughter-in-law again. No. I think it's contextually, okay, I'm not going to argue the point with you. You have decided to go. We'll do that. All right. So Naomi is ultimately willing to accept the grace of Ruth. She could have protested more. She could have said, no, you don't need to do that, dear. This is going to be hard on you. This is going to be awful for you. You don't realize what you're asking. You don't understand. You need to go back to your mother's house. But Naomi says, okay. She accepts the grace that Ruth offers.
I think that's hard for us to accept the grace.
Yeah, isn't that true? It's hard for us to accept grace sometimes. It's hard for us to accept help. Hard for us to ask for help. Naomi doesn't ask for it here, of course, but she accepts for whatever reason. We're not told exactly, but she accepts it. Yeah.
Verse 15, you say something about this, that seemingly Naomi is, don't go back, not just to your people, but to
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Blessings of Yahweh, just to you make it.
Right. Go back to her people, your sister-in-law. Notice the peer pressure argument there. Your sister-in-law is going back, you go back too. But go back to your people and your gods. Now, I think that tells us perhaps something about how Naomi, or our author, can still see Orpah returning to her land and being involved with Chemosh, the god of Moab, still being involved with the god of Moab, but yet being blessed by Yahweh. Because see, that Naomi says both things, right? Naomi says, go back to your gods. She returned to her mother and her gods. And at the same time, Naomi can pray that Yahweh will bless the Moabite women in their land, at their mother's house, that they will find rest, that Yahweh will give them rest, even in Moab, even as they serve other gods. They're not Israelites. They are not under the covenant of Israel. So how does God relate to those who are not in covenant with God? Seems to me God relates to them by how they act in chesed or not. Do they act in chesed? And so people think about Naaman. Remember, Naaman gets baptized, right? 7 times. Goes back home, and what does he do? He goes into the temple of his God. And he worships in the temple. How does God redeem those? How does God redeem a Moabite? Doesn't have to become an Israelite to redeem a Moabite. God can be at work in Moab, even if they don't recognize Yahweh is at work. Right? So I think we have to be a little more expansive. So when Jonah goes to Nineveh, He doesn't go to Nineveh and say, all of you need to become Jews. All of you need to become Israelites. He goes to Nineveh and says, repent. Repent of the evil you're doing. Do good. And God accepts that from the Ninevites. I think he accepts that from the Moabites too. Even in their darkness, or we could call it ignorance, or we call it whatever. But Naomi's expectation is that when her daughter-in-laws return to Moab, they are not losing the grace of Yahweh. Yahweh's grace is still with them. So glad you raised that point. I meant to bring that out, but thanks for bringing it up, Jeff. And that's a little, that can be a little disturbing to us, because we have a tendency to think that if you're not a part of Israel, then all those other nations are just going to hell. You know, but no, you know, don't think that's right. I don't think that's true. God judges those nations, just like he judges Israel, but he judges those nations in the light of God's dealings with people, how God deals with people. God judges according to what they have, not according to what they don't have, you know, kind of thing, that kind of principle at play. But a lot more we could say about that, but our time is up. So next week, we will focus on kind of the Job and the bitterness and the lament and Naomi coming into town. Let me raise a question for you to think about, something we can talk about next week. It says in verse 19 that when they came to Bethlehem, the house of bread, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? Now, here's a question. What's the tone of voice in is this Naomi? Is that Naomi? She doesn't look so good. Is it an expression of grief? Of shock? Or is it, look, it's a Naomi, she's back. You know, is it joy? Is it shock and grief? Like, oh, what happened to Naomi? Look at her. Or is it, Naomi's back. What a great thing. We're glad to see her. Which way do you read that? This is why we need an inspired audio Bible, right? Because an inspired audio Bible would tell us the tone of voice. And we have to discern that for ourselves. So think about that over the week, and let's talk about it next week. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.